What's up, meatbags? It's the often imitated, never duplicated Tony TGD coming at you with another video. This time we're going to be talking about Bret Hart, Tom Magee, the infamous match they had, and why I believe the legend of Tom Magee was manufactured by Bret Hart himself. First, we need a little history. We need to discuss what exactly I'm talking about, because you might not be a wrestling fan. You might only be vaguely familiar with the name Tom Magee based on a previous video I did. So basically, Bret Hart, when he was still sort of a mid-card tag team wrestler, he had a match with a man named Tom Magee. The match is said to have been so good that Tom Magee was touted as the next WWF champion. Vince McMahon was wetting his pants with anticipation of all the money he was going to make off of Tom Magee. Now, this match was lost for years. It wasn't until 2019 that the infamous match had resurfaced, and WWE made a big documentary about it, the history of the match, what it meant. It was considered the holy grail of wrestling matches because, it was lost. Nobody had it. Nobody had a copy. But where did this legend come from? I mean, I surely didn't hear about it. I was a huge wrestling fan in the 90s. Ever since I was a kid, WWF fan in the 80s, huge fan in the 90s, into the 2000s. And I heard nothing about this. I knew nothing of Tom Magee, nothing that he was supposed to be the next Hulk Hogan or whatever. This was all new to me when I heard about it first in about 2000. I want to say 2009 is when I first heard this legend of Tom Magee. But I really didn't think nothing of it. But the legend grew, and like I said, we eventually got that nice documentary from the WWF. They even got a Wikipedia page on it. Talks about it. But if we go to the Google Trends, you can see Google Trends since 2004. It doesn't go all the way back, but no one was looking up Mr. Magee really until 2019 or 2018, right before the match was going to air, and then 2019 when the match did air. If we look up Tom Magee versus Bret Hart, we see the same thing. Not until 2019 we get any real interest in this. So if this was a legendary match, this was a match people were interested in, sure as hell weren't searching Google trying to look for it. Sure as hell weren't Googling things about it. And if you take the time to Google Tom Magee, Bret Hart, Tom Magee WWF champion, you'll notice an odd thing that all the articles seem to be written around the time of 2019. It's like all the history, all the talk, the buzz was in 2019. You might get an odd article about Tom Magee on some obscure website somewhere talking about his weightlifting career. You might get a couple of people mentioning Tom Magee as part of historical wrestling history, not in regard to the match, just in the fact that he existed and was a wrestler. But you don't get a lot of this Hulk Hogan, next Hulk Hogan talk, next WWF champion talk. So I had to, I started deep diving into it ever since I made that last video, because I kind of believed the myth myself, the legend. I mean, the guy is a former weightlifter. He's huge. He's very athletic. I've watched lots of his matches that I could find on YouTube. I mean, he wasn't a terrible wrestler. He wasn't no Bret Hart, that's for sure, but he wasn't terrible. But I stumbled upon this website here. This was written in 2019. It's the Surreal Saga of Tom Magee. It was written by Scrooge McSuck. And he mentions that the first time he heard the name Tom Magee spelled incorrectly was reading a book written by Bret Hart himself. Now, we're not going to read the whole article. I'll link it in the description if you want to read the whole thing. It goes into a lot about Tom's history, some of the other things, but there's a few key paragraphs I want to hit on because I think they shed some light onto why I believe Bret Hart himself created this myth. Now, if we go down here, there's an excerpt from the book. It says, as I left the dressing room that night, I turned to Owen and said, "See you next week in Rochester." I couldn't help but notice the handsome, muscle-headed rookie, Tom Magee. He couldn't walk across the ring without tripping. So right now, Bret is his first mention of Tom Magee in the book is basically saying he's a decent-looking guy who is horrible in the ring. He can't get to the ring without tripping over his own feet. Then later on, Bret says, I found Magee with Owen and told him that if he trusted me, I'd get him over. Give me your 3 absolute best moves. If you have a good match, Vince will have big plans for you. I designed a match that was really simple, inserting his big moves at just the right time. Minutes later, I walked out with Jimmy Hart to a chorus of boos. Then Magee came out looking like a handsome, well-muscled statue with curly golden locks. The crowd cheered as he jumped straight up to the ring and then skipped right over the top rope. Once the bell sounded, he did everything exactly as I told him. As good as he looked, he was a horrible, pathetically phony. I struggled to maneuver him into place without the fans realizing his shortcomings, putting on an absolute clinic for anyone who ever wanted to make a big green guy look great. Says, when I came back through the curtain, Vince McMahon and Pat Patterson had swarmed all over Magee. Afterward, it was Tom who told me that Vince nearly wet his pants while watching the TV monitor as he exclaimed loud enough for all to hear, "That's my new champion." You see, according to Bret here, he made this horrible wrestler look so good that Vince McMahon nearly wet his pants watching the match on the monitor. He was excited. That's his new champion. But funny thing is, if we ask Tom Magee tells things a little bit differently. Tom has a slightly different take on what happened after the match. So let's hear what he has to say. This is a Inside the Ropes interview with Tom Magee talking about the infamous match. We're just going to listen to a little clip.
There is this kind of long-standing story that Vince McMahon saw you initially as the next Hulk Hogan. Is that something you remember from your interaction? What were your interactions like with Vince?
Told me that.
Did Vince give you any kind of inclination that was the case?
So there was a lot of interest in me when I came, and so I felt I was being heavily, really scrutinized and observed. But there was a lot of opinions circulating too about what to do or what they were going to do, and I'm hearing stuff like that as I'm going through, right? And but when I came out. First of all, I felt good in myself about what had happened, so that was number one. But next, the conversation about what Vince said, I never heard that. Never heard it. And I was never aware of it until decades later.
I mean, for you...
Tom Magee himself says he never heard it, was never aware of it until decades later, which contradicts Bret Hart's book, contradicts Bret Hart saying that Tom Magee was the one who told him that Vince McMahon was calling Tom Magee the next world champion. So what's going on here? Somebody's obviously lying or misremembering what happened. Now, if Tom Magee was lying, it would kind of seem silly. I mean, everybody thinks that this is the way the story went, right? Everybody thinks that Vince McMahon was so excited to see Tom Magee that he named him his next champion, and he was off to the races. But for Tom to dispute that, it's kind of silly. I mean, unless the truth is that it didn't happen, right? Because if that's a lie, if Tom had lied to Bret Hart, or that never really happened. But Tom was a egomaniac, egotistical. He would just go with it, right? Yeah, of course Vince McMahon said I look like $1,000,000. Except for Tom's a humble guy. You hear it in his voice. That's not what happened. Now Bret Hart is known to be egotistical. He's known to actually believe that he is the best there is, the best there was, the best there ever will be. Now, wrestling's a funny business because wrestling's not real. It's all scripted. Accolades like championships, they're not really as meaningful as people like to make them out to be, But being a good wrestler, being the best in the ring, it's more than just winning belts. It's the ability to have a good match with anybody. It's the ability to carry people to good matches. Someone like a Mick Foley, he can have a good match with damn near anybody. He can make somebody like a Louis Piccoli look good. He was in ECW having good matches with bottom of the barrel wrestlers, people that make Tom Magee look good by comparison. But as we can see, Bret Hart basically said Tom Magee was a horrible wrestler that he made look like $1,000,000. Which is weird, because if we go to, this is the list of Pro Wrestling Illustrated Rookie of the Year awards. We go to 1986. Lex Luger won. Bam Bam Bigelow was the runner-up. Sting was the second runner-up. And the third runner-up in fourth place was Tom Magee. Now this was voted on by fans, by people who watch matches. So, if Tom Magee was so horrible in the ring, how is it that he managed to make fourth place as a Rookie of the Year? Were there just no one else? These were the only four individuals that debuted in 1986, in the 85-86 year, Or was it possible that Tom Magee actually was a decent wrestler? I mean, he had a lot of athleticism. He would come to the ring, get on the top rope, flip off. He had a great look. He could do drop kicks like nobody's business. Very muscular. Now, if you watch a lot of Tom Magee matches, like I was forced to do in order to properly, research this, Tom Magee's biggest failing as a wrestler was the fact that he wasn't mean. He wasn't angry. He didn't take advantage of others. He was a nice guy. He didn't want to hit nobody too hard, so his punches looked weak. Some of his kicks looked weak. He looked like someone who was unsure of his own abilities, his own strength, that he didn't want to hurt others, because Tom Magee is a former world's strongest man. So I believe that, that was probably his real issue. The real issue was that he was not willing to hit people the way that you got to hit people to be a wrestler. Terry Funk is famous for his left hand. It's one of the best looking in the business. And Mick Foley, in his book, said that Terry Funk's secret to that famous left hand that looks so good is that Terry Funk hits you as hard as he fucking can. And that's it. I mean, and that's the kind of thing that Tom Magee didn't have the personality to do. He just wasn't going to hit people. He wasn't going to hurt people. He was trying to take care of the other guy in the ring, and that was detrimental to his ability to sell wrestling. But like I said, he was good enough to make third runner-up for Rookie of the Year. Now, in the same article, they talk about Dave Meltzer mentioning Tom Magee. Let's see if I can find it here. Here we go. This is from Dave Meltzer's Wrestling Observer newsletter, It's a May 19th, 1997 issue. He says, and this was in regards to Ken Shamrock, who had just came to the WWF. He says, a decade ago, there was a strongman, gymnast, acrobat, actor, bodybuilder who was trained in Calgary by the name of Tom Magee. He was 6'5", looks of a model, physique of an ultimate warrior, one of the strongest men alive, and could do cartwheels and backflips in the ring. In those days where size and physique ruled, he was a guy who was nearly as big as Hulk Hogan and 10 times the athlete. He had world champion written all over him. That was until he was put in the ring one night in Rochester, New York, at a WWF television taping. He had a dark match with a solid prelim wrestler who was experienced at getting good matches out of total stiffs. Magee was so impressive in that match that it became almost preordained after the guy's very first WWF match that he was the next Hulk Hogan, the heir to the throne. Of course, Tom Magee never made it in pro wrestling. He had no charisma, and he couldn't translate his athletic gifts into making a match. He never had another match 1/10 as good as the match he had in Rochester. About 5 years later, the wrestling world had changed once again. The guy put on the throne was the solid prelim wrestler, Bret Hart. The moral of the story is you can only take first impressions for what they are. First impressions. It's great. Nice little write-up there. But you'll notice he doesn't make any mention of Vince McMahon saying that Tom was going to be the next WWF champion. He doesn't really talk about Tom Magee as being a horrible wrestler, just not a good one. But I think Bret saw this, because Bret strikes me as the type of person that would, look up his name, want to know every time someone's even mentioned him. I think Bret took this and he built it into something bigger than it was. Sure, Tom Magee was brought in. He was a big guy. They probably thought, hey, we could see what we can do with this guy, put him on the road. Maybe we'll build him into a solid competitor. But I don't believe that he was ever destined to be the next Hulk Hogan. I don't believe that Vince McMahon ever saw this guy and thought, he's it. I've watched the match. I've watched the infamous Tom Magee versus Bret Hart. It wasn't that impressive. It wasn't some huge 5-star match. And now, Dave Meltzer himself, who speaks of Tom Magee as if he saw the match, has admitted in more recent times that he didn't actually see the match, that he only heard about it from secondhand reports. Yet here he writes about it as if he knew. So I believe that, Dave Meltzer here wrote a little paragraph about Tom Magee in regards to Ken Shamrock. I believe that Bret Hart saw this and built a legend around it, built the legend of Tom Magee. Now, Vince McMahon himself, as far as I know, has never went on record saying anything about whether or not Tom Magee was the next Hulk Hogan, whether or not he had big plans for him, which I think puts another nail in the coffin. I think there was a lot of talk about Tom. I think there was a lot of people who felt threatened by him. I believe when he went on the road for the WWF, that the wrestlers that he was scheduled to work with didn't give him a fair shake, didn't treat him with the respect that he deserved. They probably didn't put him over the way they should have. They didn't work with him to help him improve. And ultimately, the wrestling world lost what should have been another huge name in the business. And instead, we ended up with the Ultimate Warrior taking on the mantle of the next WWF champion. But really, that's all I want to say about this. Like I said, I believe that Bret Hart, the egomaniac that he is, wanting to be the best, wanting to be seen as the greatest wrestler of all time, got wind of this Dave Meltzer write-up, concocted the story of Tom Magee being handpicked as the next WWF champion. You know, earlier in the book, he basically downplays Tom as a horrible wrestler in order to show just how good Bret is. Bret is so good that he took this horrible wrestler that he dismissed earlier in the book to a match that was so great that Vince McMahon was wetting his pants with excitement over how great Tom Magee looked. Now, does that sound like something that Bret would do? To me, it sure as hell does. But that's all I gotta say about that. Love, peace, booty grease. We out this bitch.